Hi everyone, my name is Ashwin Krishnan. Welcome to Unacademy's GMAT channel. Today we have a special guest, Ms. Veni Arora from the HPS class of 23. Welcome Veni, and thank you so much for joining us today. Let me quickly introduce Veni for our viewers. Veni is from Delhi. She did her BCom from Shriram College of Commerce. She then went on to work for A.T. Kearney as a business analyst for 2 years, post which she was an associate at Bain Capital for another couple of years before joining HPS. Veni, it's great to have you. Do you want to talk about your journey before joining HPS? What was it like? And how did you end up at HPS? What was your thought process while choosing an MBA? If you can just touch upon that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So we can start with your first question, which is my journey pre-HPS. I think you covered some of it.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I grew up in Delhi. I did my undergrad from SRCC. I grew up really loving numbers as a kid. Very weirdly, I loved math. And so I gravitated towards an undergrad in accounting and finance.
Right.
After that, I wanted to work in an industry which exposes me to different functions and different industries versus choosing upfront what I want to do. And so I went on to join management consulting. And my role while I was at A.T. Kearney involved working with clients in the private sector as well as the public sector.
Okay.
And I did projects which involved strategy as well as implementation. So
Right.
I felt like I got a lot of diverse experiences, which was a great learning experience, especially at that young age.
Right.
And one of my clients was a client that I worked with for a year, which is a long time period in the context of consulting, where most
True.
projects are typically a couple of months, right?
Yeah.
And this client was the portfolio company of a private equity investor.
Okay.
And so that's how I got exposed to the investing world, found it to be super exciting, and made a switch to the other side of the table. That's when I moved to Mumbai for the first time. By the way, definitely love Mumbai more than Delhi. I think a lot of people are not going to like that. And I joined Bain Capital.
Right.
While I was at Bain Capital, I evaluated a bunch of deals in financial services. And Bain Capital as a fund invests in late stage companies. So worked with a bunch of banks, NBFCs, life insurance companies in India. After that, I decided to head for my MBA, and right now I'm in Boston in 2 degrees Celsius. So yeah.
Wow, that sounds exciting. So what I was thinking as you were kind of talking about your journey was that the exposure to such roles generally happens for a lot of us post MBA. But it's interesting that you already have experienced, uh, roles at A.T. Kearney and at Bain Capital pre MBA, which means the exposure that you've got is extremely good, right? I mean, I have a lot of friends who are in management consulting who ended up there post their MBA. So,
Yeah.
and maybe then I can understand why you moved towards a business degree as such. Perfect. That sounds good. So were there uh, aspects of your role specifically at A.T. Kearney or at Bain, which uh, so you did your BCom, right? But from the path from BCom to MBA is not that straightforward, right? So, what were certain aspects of your work profile which said, you know what, an MBA at this point in time makes sense?
Yeah. To be very honest, I think while I was in undergrad, I thought I would do an MBA in India. So I was planning to take my CAT and doing all the prep for that.
Right,
But then once I got through A.T. Kearney, most people from business schools in India would end up joining consulting firms.
right,
And I felt like I was already in a consulting firm. So then the
exactly,
value of an MBA to me was like, do I really want to do it right now?
exactly,
And so I decided to kind of park that idea for a
right,
while till I was in, 2020, where I was like, okay, why not give it a shot?
right,
And so when I was deciding in 2020, the options for me were more in the US. And I thought about it in three ways. So one was the global exposure. I
right,
felt like it was something I definitely wanted to get in my life. And after a certain age, it just gets really hard to be moving around.
right,
And so I felt I was at that right moment where I could move to another country and get exposure to a lot of different perspectives.
right,
So that was one.
Right.
Second, my role at Bain Capital was for 2 years. So it's a pre-MBA role.
Right.
And I had to decide what was next for me. Like, did I want to continue in investing, or did I want to make a switch to another career?
Right.
And I felt like doing an MBA would give me the time to really introspect and do a bunch of internships to figure out what
Makes
do I
sense.
really want to do next versus just jumping right into it.
Right.
And then the third aspect was the fact that I felt like my network was very limited to my undergrad and then my jobs,
Right.
and was highly India focused, and
Hmm.
all the people were very similar to me. And I felt like expanding that network can obviously happen without an MBA. Like, I'm not saying it can't, but an
Right.
MBA is just a more structured way of getting it done.
True.
And I felt like I needed that to happen to be able to build a solid network that can actually benefit you in the long term. It's very hard to attribute a value to it upfront, but I think you often hear stories of how people met in business school and ended up launching a business together 20 years
Yeah.
down the line.
Yeah.
And I felt like I wanted the ability to have such a story one day if
Right.
that is what luck has for me.
Wow. I mean, I think the way you articulated it makes a lot of sense, right? And I just want to slightly touch upon the third aspect of what you mentioned, which is basically the peer group which you find at B schools, right? I mean, there are a lot of institutions now which offer an MBA online, right? But nothing compares to the peer group that you might find in college on campus when you're bonding, when you're doing assignments together, when you're building that network, like you said, right? So
Or
can
when
you?
you're partying together, I think
No, of course.
that is also an important
True.
aspect.
True, true. So can you talk us a little bit about your peer group at HBS? Who, I mean, in India, you will find a lot of similar profiles in a class of 60 or 80. How different is it at HBS? And can you give us some examples of some of your peers? What backgrounds are they from, and how does this help, while doing an MBA abroad?
Yeah, for sure. So it was really, really surprising, honestly, how diverse it is. I know everyone talks about it, but I don't think you really appreciate it till you're in the classroom.
Right,
So I have friends who are, from a doctor background, who are doctors. And so when we're
right,
doing a case on healthcare, their perspective is like so valuable to hear
right.
from.
Makes sense.
Then we have people who worked in the nonprofit sector for 3 to 4 years before they came to business school.
Right,
And so a lot of times the perspective they bring will be more to do with rural areas and sustainability, and things that we would normally not think about when working in the private sector.
right,
So I think those diverse perspectives really help you grow as a person,
right,
and really help you challenge your thinking almost. Like, there are times when I show up in the classroom having a super capitalist point of view, and then you hear everyone else talking about aspects which are so different and aspects that you would not have even thought about, that I
makes
think
sense.
it's really humbling to be learning
Right.
from people who come from such backgrounds.
Wow, that's really interesting. Got it. Okay. Now just going back to your journey, right? So you are at Bain Capital, and you've now decided that you want to pursue an MBA. So how did you go about shortlisting colleges? What are the factors that you considered uh, on whether you want to apply to a college or not?
Yeah, sure. So I think the strategy I was told about by a bunch of admission consultants as well as ex-MBAs was that you should think about it as round one versus round two. So a lot of people would apply to their top priority schools in round one. And then if you don't get in, then you apply to your second priority schools in round two. So
Right,
that's what my framework was. And then
right,
in terms of creating the priority list itself, so I think one obvious factor is the rankings, which everyone obviously refers to.
right,
Beyond that, I think there are certain factors that you can look at based on what your priorities are.
right.
So, to give a few examples, one would be location. So, for example, if you want to do internships in startups, obviously the West Coast is a better location than the East Coast.
Interesting.
There are obviously startups in New York, there are startups in Boston as well. But just in terms of the breadth and depth, it's obviously going to be
Mhm.
more in the Valley.
Right,
Obviously, with Zoom, you can do remote internships, but you
right.
also have to keep in mind factors such as the time difference,
Yeah,
um, or the or just the inability to go and meet the team in person,
right,
right? So the location would be one.
right,
Second, I would say that in an MBA, what often happens is that you get exposed not just to the business school students, but also to students of different schools within the business school. So, for example, Harvard is known for their law school as well.
Right.
They're also known for their medical school. So if you think you want to pursue something in the future that will have dependencies on these other degrees, you will be able to do, cross-registered courses as well as meet people from these different backgrounds. So that would be the second. The third one I would say would just be scholarships. I think coming from India, that is often an important factor for people. And all schools have a very different take on it. I know Harvard has a need-based program versus
Right.
having an ability-based program.
Got it.
I'm sure it differs by school, and so I think that is another element I would I would end up deep diving into while thinking about schools to go to. Apart
Understood.
from that, I'd say these are some of the factors which you can Google and find out about. But I
Right.
think there are also certain softer elements to schools which I would try to find out by speaking to either the current students or the ex-students. So, things like what is the culture of the school like? I know some schools have Fridays off, which means that you get a lot more time if you're working on a startup or if you're doing an in-semester internship, or if you just want to travel a lot in the US, right?
Right.
Versus a lot of other schools would end up, focusing more on academics. And so
Right.
you learn a lot more. But it really depends on what you're looking to get out of the MBA, right? So I think there are certain softer elements that you can judge based on conversations with students. And I would definitely not miss out on that opportunity if I
Right.
was to short. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, when we apply for a job, right, we generally look at culture. But it's
Yeah.
interesting that you talk about culture of an institution and how it can vary between colleges. Wow, that's something which I learned
Yeah,
today at
totally.
least. So, I mean, maybe just to touch upon that. So, what's the culture at Harvard like? And how is it different from maybe a couple of other schools which you might know of?
So I think the biggest difference I see is the emphasis on academics that I was talking about.
Right.
So Harvard is known for its, case-based method of learning,
Right.
which I think has honestly been in some ways life-changing for me. I think when you hear about it, it just sounds like, oh, okay, you're going to do a case study. Like,
Yeah.
how big of a deal can that be? But just being in the classroom and learning from your peers is something that helps you actually remember things in a better manner. And it also helps you kind of learn in a more rounded fashion, right? Because you're hearing from such diverse perspectives, coming back to the point we were talking about just before
Right.
this.
Right.
Uh, so I think there are obviously certain costs to that, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, we don't have Fridays off.
Right.
So you have to kind of think about the pros and cons.
Hmm.
But I think for me, at least, the learning element here and the focus on learning has been really, really awesome. Uh, and having said that, I would also say that there are ways you can customize your schedule. So for example, in the RC year, which is the first year,
Right.
you have required courses and you have to do exactly the courses that are decided by Harvard. But in the
Okay.
second year, you can choose what courses you want to do, and so you can actually create a schedule for yourself which is more on the lighter side if that's what you want,
Right.
or you can take more courses if that's what you want to do. So I think you can kind
Interesting.
of you know make
Interesting.
it to be what you want it to be. Yeah.
Understood. Understood. And if you can just, I mean, touch upon the world famous case studies of Harvard, right? I mean, a lot of Indian B schools are trying to emulate that model. But having been through some of these classes, having attended some of them, what's so special about them, and what does it do for your learning when
Yeah.
I mean, when you go through a case study versus trying to just learn all the concepts from just books?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are three elements I would talk about. One, the fact that it's not really led by the professor in a way that you have to just be answering whatever you're asked. So, example, in India, when I was in my undergrad, it's like the professor would be asking a question on, say, accounting, and you would
Right,
raise your hand and you'd be like, yeah, like you have to do ABC, right?
right, right,
Uh, and the answer of ABC would be something you learned in your textbook.
right,
Uh, in this, what happens is that you're given a case, and a
right,
case is basically a real life situation that somebody in a CXO position has gone through in their life. And you have to basically put yourself in those shoes and think about what you should be doing or what you would decide to do.
Right.
So I think it's just way more interactive. So in every class, what happens is that you'll have most of the students raising up their hands, and they'll be the ones who answer questions, and the professor is just a facilitator. He's
Right.
not the one who's answering the question. The students are answering the questions. So
Got
I
it.
think it's an interesting shift,
Right.
and it makes sure that the class is more interactive and more people are participating. So that's fun. Second, I would say that just being in those shoes makes it very, very real for you. And
Hmm.
you have to actually make a choice. It's not like you can say, oh, it depends, and maybe I'll do A or maybe I'll do
Right.
B. You have
Right.
to exactly say, okay, this is what me, Veni, would do in this situation.
Right.
And I think that just makes it so much more real,
Right.
that you're forced to spend time thinking about it. So many times there are cases we do where the students end up discussing the cases for weeks after the case is over, because
Wow.
it's just so interesting and you're just like still debating, okay, what am I going to do if I was in this position?
Right.
Uh, I think that's super helpful. And then the third thing I would say is that the cases are very diverse. So there are cases which are on India, there are cases which are on the US market, there are cases which would be again in the private sector or the public sector.
Right.
I just think having so many diverse stories to learn from and still being able to apply the learnings from that in a more generic fashion just kind of tells you how, even though we're all in different roles and different industries, at the end of the day it
Right.
just comes down to, very similar thinking and very similar decision making,
Yeah.
which I
Makes
think makes you really fit for like different professions.
Yeah, I mean, the whole immersive aspect of the case study and just the fact that you're exposed to various industries and uh, you get a feeler of what it feels like to be running a company, to be part of such a company. I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. Um, Okay, so you spoke about a few factors that you considered, right, when you wanted to apply to a college. But were there some doubts in your mind as to whether you would actually want to go ahead and do the MBA abroad or not, right? Because a lot of us, a lot of our viewers as well, there is always this decision of doing an MBA here versus abroad, or whether, actually wanting to do an MBA at all. If let's say your work is fulfilling, you are in a set career path. So what are those doubts that you had in mind before applying?
Yeah, for sure. I think I was honestly super confused. I remember before I was writing my GMAT, I was like, why don't I just give this exam and then figure it out? It's not like I was sure I want to do an MBA even while I was prepping for my GMAT.
Right.
So I think there were two things that really bothered me. One was the time commitment, right? It's
Hmm.
2 years. And when you're in your 20s, I just think in general, 2 years sounds like a long time period.
Sure.
And so I was worried about the impact it would have on my career and if
Right.
I really wanted to take that time off.
Right.
I think what helped me was that a mentor advised me to think of my career as a marathon and not as a sprint. And I think that perspective kind of changes things for you, because
Right.
when you think of your career as 30 years and you're like, oh, like 2 years is not that
Right.
long of a time period
Right.
to
Right.
be going away for. And that made me feel like the time was more of an investment and not a cost. And when you start thinking of it that way, I think it becomes worth it.
Yeah.
So that was one. The second, I would say the cost. It's obviously super expensive, especially if you earn in INR and want to spend in dollars,
True.
right? But I think what I found out was that a lot of colleges have really, really good financial aid programs,
Right.
and they do end up funding you anywhere from like 50 to 100% depending on the situation.
Interesting.
So I think that's also something to keep in mind, and you should not, really let that discourage you. You should always apply, and
Right.
then financials will get figured out. And then, of course, like if you look at the data, it'll tell you that for most, like for most of the schools in the US, you will end up recovering that cost over a long period of time.
Right.
Uh, so yeah.
Got it. Makes sense. So if you're deciding to pursue an MBA in the US, what are the different aspects of your profile that you should be focusing on?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's like people will tell you it's like a black box. It's really hard to say what these schools are looking for, but I think
Right.
there are a few high level buckets of
Right.
criteria that I can talk through.
Right.
So one, I would say academics. So,
Hmm.
and I think the way they judge that is the undergrads you went to. Like most people in the US know of schools where people in India are applying from. So the schools are like they know about it. It's not like it's the first time they're hearing about SRCC or IIT or even any of the other ones.
Interesting.
That's one proxy they use, and then the second one is obviously GMAT,
Right.
which I guess we'll talk more about.
Yeah.
And then the second one, I would say that beyond academics, they want to think of students who have more of a rounded personality. So they look for extracurriculars that you may have been a part of, and that can be anything ranging from sports, music, nonprofits, whatever it is that
Right.
interests you.
Right.
The third one I would say is your work experience and how it links to what you want to do in the future. So, and when I say work experience, like I don't just mean brands. Like, of course, it's good to work for big companies, but
Right.
it's more about the quality of work and the kind of projects you ended up doing.
Got it.
And the essay is a very good place to bring that out,
Right.
right? And then how that links to your future goals. So, for example, if you want to work in investing, but you'd work in consulting before this,
Right.
they would want to hear some kind of link between how that switch is going to take place.
Right.
So while obviously, people make switches in MBA from their past career to a different career,
Right.
the link has to be kind of, laid out and fleshed out a little bit more.
Makes sense. Makes sense. You spoke about the essay, right? And this is an important aspect of the whole application process. So can you talk us through how do you go about writing the essay? What are the key aspects that every candidate should touch upon? You also spoke about uh, highlighting your thought process and wanting to switch job profiles or career paths, right? So how do you structure this in an essay, and how important is this in the application process?
Yeah. So I think there's no right or wrong way of writing the essay. It just has to be super personal to you. I think the fun part about writing the essay is that you have to basically introspect about your entire life to date and then
Right.
what you want to do in the future, which I think is something we don't often get to do in just our everyday lives of,
Right.
doing 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And so I think the idea is to look back on your life and find common themes that have emerged
Right.
over the years and try to link those themes to what you want to do in the future. And I think for a lot of people, this introspection process ends up being the way they find out what they want to do with their careers.
Right.
And so it's not just about writing the essay, but actually, learning more about yourself in
Yeah.
the process. The other thing I would say is that it's a good idea to have a consultant who can walk you through the essay writing process.
Right.
I think the way they look for essays in the US is a little bit different from what we're used to in India. So I think having a consultant who can guide you through that and help you through that is like really, really helpful. The only thing I would say is that you should not think of the essay consultant as the one who will just do everything, right?
Right.
So at the end of the day, you're the one who has to do the thinking and you have to do the writing.
Right.
They're more there to guide you and to tell you what not to write. So they won't tell you what to write, but they'll tell you to not write this.
Right.
Right.
When we speak to a lot of alumni, right, or the common belief is that you need a GMAT score of 750 plus to get into Harvard. How did you crack Harvard with a GMAT score of 730? That's really interesting.
Yeah. I think you're bringing back like really rough memories for me. I was so annoyed writing the GPAT. So yeah, I think a bunch of people told me that, oh, you need like a 750 plus score, especially as an Indian applicant, and there's like a cutoff, quote
Right.
unquote, that you
Right.
have to, pass.
Right.
And so I did take my GMAT 3 times, and I thought the score would improve, and my mocks were seeing improvement, but I got the exact same score every time. And I think the challenge is that these scores are often misunderstood. So I think what I've realized now is that schools don't really look at GMAT scores as a filter. So it's not like they're going to say, okay, you're below 750, you're an Indian, so I'm just going to filter you out. It's more as an input to your entire application, and it's one of the factors that is looked at. And so I decided to focus on other aspects of my application, like my essay and my LORs, to kind of make up for the score in some ways. And I would say the second thing is that the scores are generally an average, right? So the average for most of the Ivy Leagues would be 720-ish.
Right.
And so, which by definition means that half of the class is below that 720 number,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah.
So I would just say, like, don't let your GMAT score, really, really discourage you so much that you just don't apply. And just try to highlight other aspects of your application that can make up for it.
How did you go about preparing for your GMAT exam? And can you share a few tips for our viewers?
Sure. So my GMAT prep was along with my job. So I was basically doing it in my free time. And so I spent about 4 to 6 weeks preparing before I took my first attempt.
Okay.
And during that time, I referred to the original GMAT guides to
Right.
prepare, which were one GMAT guide, which included both subjects, or actually all 4 subjects. And then
Right.
there are also subject-wise original guides, which I
Yeah.
referred to.
Yeah.
And then I used the official mocks as well during this time period to judge where I should be working more on. And then after my first attempt, I spent another 2 to 4 weeks preparing, and then I took my second attempt.
Got it. Got it.
In terms of tips, I would say 3 things. One, just kind of start early. There are very few people who get their GMAT score right in the first attempt. In fact, I would say I know nobody who was
Yeah.
happy with their first attempt GMAT score. So you are probably going to take it 2 to 3 times. So just, make sure you budget for that time. Second, I would say prepare a little bit every day versus trying to do it all over the weekends. So there was a time when I was trying to do it all over the weekends and that's it. But I think it's just very hard to focus for that longer duration with something like a GMAT exam. And so eventually what I did was that I started doing, randomly I would just like have a list of 10 questions that I would spend 20 to 30 minutes doing during a workday. I think that really helped pace up my preparedness for the exam.
Yeah.
And then finally, I would say that take the mock early rather than later. I think a lot of people would wait for the right time to feel super prepared before they take the mock. But I think the reality is that the mocks help you prioritize what to be focusing on. And so you can just end up prepping a lot more of quant while you're really good at quant. And the mocks will help you figure that out. So yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So thanks a lot for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. This was really, really lovely. And you took me down the memory lane. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation.